Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 of your lecture series for Intro to Academic Writing. So today, what are we going to be covering? So part 1 is going to be reading skills and note making. Part 2 is going to be paraphrasing and summarizing. So that's where I'm going to actually pause the lecture and I'm going to divide them into two halves. And then part 3 is going to be a little bit of discussion around your first essay, so requirements, different uh, processes and steps that you can take in putting it all together. And part 4 is going to be academic language, so some tips for how you can make your essay sound really put together and like a university piece of writing. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is reading skills and note making. So, in terms of reading speed, how does it affect your study? What happens if you read too fast and what slows your reading down? I suppose for the first one, and this is something distant students, you can actually pause here and have a bit of a think for yourself about what happens if you read too fast. For me, I think it means that I take in less of what I'm reading. That's quite simply the case. So I think that if you read too fast, you're not getting the maximum that you can out of your work. And certainly when you come to reading the article by Carol Dweck that you need to for your essay, reading it at a pace that is something that allows you to take in all the important material is really important. What slows your reading down? I think trying to get your headspace into a place where you are calm, you're in a relaxed environment and you're taking in stuff as you need to, and you're taking the maximum amount of information is probably the best way to kind of slow your reading down and to get the maximum out of what you're doing. Tips for reading at uni. So, how can you read more efficiently? I know in the lectures that I give in Hobart, when I'm talking to my students who are on campus, I often say to them if they've got a piece of writing that they need to read, I always say to them, find a quiet place, make yourself, some food or a hot drink or something like that, and just sit calmly and read. The reality of the reading experience at university is probably that you're going to have to read pieces of text a number of times. So if you sit down and read that Carol Dweck article once, that's a really good thing, but you're going to get more out of it on the second and third read. So always bear that in mind as well. I think the first read is a good chance to just get an overall idea of what's in the article, what are the most important things, what is it talking about, what clues does the title give me, all of those sorts of things. So as it says here, be selective, read to get the gist of the article or the chapter, and that's always a good place to start. Don't put too much pressure on yourself, um, particularly when you're reading it for the first time, to understand every little thing that's going on. I think if you read over it and get the gist of what's happening, that's a really positive first step. Read to find a particular piece of information. This becomes a really key skill when you are doing essays, because if you read with a particular essay question in mind, that can become part of your strategy as a student. So if you're looking for particular thematic ideas, if you're looking for particular ideas that your lecturer has already signaled to you, then if you're doing that reading and looking for those ideas, that can be part of your strategic reading of the piece. And it also helps to survey, skim, and scan. So basically, it means if you look over the text, in a brief way, and pick out what some of those keywords and some of those collections of words are conveying to you, then that can be a really helpful way for you to read a piece for the first time as well. So surveying a text. Surveying the text means looking at the table of contents, at chapter headings, at summaries or abstracts for an overview of content and purpose. quite simply just looking for that key information. So this is just a visual representation of what that surveying can look like. You can see that there's a bit of a skim here of interesting research, which is the title, and then the eye is drawn down to the contents page, where it's moved quite rapidly over this information, and then back up to the next title over here, back to a quick scan of the authors and what we call the abstract here as well, which is basically a kind of short summary of what you will find in the rest of the article. So skimming means looking over a text quickly, looking for keywords, headings, tables, and illustrations to get the gist of the content. Never starting to read without first quickly skimming through the text to get an idea of what it's about. So for instance, with the article that we have by Carol Dweck, the, the point that mindsets is in the title gives you a first initial idea of perhaps what you're going to be finding within that article that you might have to write something about. So that skimming initially can give you that first idea as to what this article is actually about. So this is another example of skimming where you can look at the title here, then the eye skips the author's details and goes down to the first part of the abstract. And then the eye skips again down to the first couple of lines of the introduction, and then down again up here to the first subheading and a little bit more reading here. So you can see that skimming is a little bit more strategic with how we weed out the information that we need. Scanning means looking quickly through the text to find a specific piece of information. If you only need a specific piece of information, scanning the text to find it. Don't read the whole text in detail. So, scanning the text, if you had an assessment or you had done a whole lot of research and you'd perhaps gone through 10 journal articles or something like that from a library, but you're really just after this research information here, this data, then that's what your eye would be scanning for. So, you would just look very quickly over these 2 pages and you would just look for this information here and use it in the piece that you are writing. So when do you survey, skim, and scan? Essentially, you do these as you need to. Depends on the type of writing that you're doing and the type of research that you need to do. My advice for the Carol Dweck article that you guys are going to be writing an essay on is you might need to use all 3 of these at different points. Initially, what I would suggest you do is I would actually survey the text, have a quick look over the sorts of keywords and the groupings of ideas and maybe the subheadings. Um, and then I would read the text in more detail so that you can understand what's going on in different paragraphs and from the beginning, middle, and end. I think skimming and scanning are skills that you can come back to as you're in the process of writing your essay, where you may need to come back and actually identify key aspects of information when you're putting a particular paragraph together. You will also need to read for detail. So, reading for detail will take time. It will require rereading, and it may help to ask yourself, what am I looking for in this reading? So, this approach will help you to read actively. So, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, rereading the Dweck article 2 or 3 times is really going to help your comprehension. If you think about favorite movies that you have, if you watch it once, you can probably remember bits and pieces of it in a few months' time. But if you've watched your favorite movie 26 times, you can probably quote from it pretty easily. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to go and read the Dweck article 26 times, but it makes the point that you'll become really familiar with something if you reread it more than once. So, here are some general reading tips for you. So, the first one is before you begin to read, take a little time to think about what you already know about the topic. So, in our case, we're looking at mindsets. If you're a student who's repeating this unit, then just a quick note that you'll be looking at the Langer article and not the Dweck article. But for the majority of us who are looking at the Dweck article, you might want to just have a think about what you know about mindsets. If you don't know what the word mindset is, you might like to look that up and maybe do a little bit of pre reading with that. If you can, make some notes as you go through. You might even just want to read the article first without any notes. You might find that a much easier proposition. On the second attempt, making some notes might be more natural because you know what's coming up in different paragraphs. Then write down some questions for yourself. What do you want to find out about this? So there might be some questions that you can jot down in the margins, which help you think critically about this particular process. And after each section, pause, think, make a few notes, and ask more questions. So, particularly where there are subheadings, you might just like to pause and perhaps even summarize in the margin what's going on and what have you learnt in that particular section. Identify key points. This will be particularly useful when it comes to writing your essay. So if there's a particular point that's covered in a couple of different paragraphs, perhaps just write that in the margin. When you've finished, talk yourself through those main points. See if you understand those. It might be that you need to do some more research on those. If there are people that are referred to and you don't know who they are, do a quick Google search, figure out who they are. And make sure your notes reflect what you've learned as a whole. So, some students like to make a mind map or other sorts of visual representation. So, on campus students, we actually played around with making a map, which was a really useful way of sorting our information and ideas. Distance students, I believe you have done the same thing. It's a good way of just dividing up and making sense of all this information that you have in front of you. The reading tips we've just looked at include taking notes. So, why do we take notes as we read? Um, Firstly, to remember what we've read. I think if you've got notes, particularly in years to come when you guys go on and do whatever degree, whatever associate degree or bachelor degree you go on to complete, it's good to have a robust set of notes because they will help you with exams, they will help you with assessments, and it means that you don't have to constantly reread everything in front of you. You've got those notes, you've got those key questions to help you really interrogate a text. So it helps you to remember what you've read because you can just scan down the notes or the margin and remember what you have actually been over. It also helps you to note the information relevant to your task, and you'll become very, very good at doing that, at picking out the things that are most relevant to what it is you're trying to accomplish. You'll also get really good at identifying the key ideas of other thinkers on a topic. And really, that for me is a key aspect of essay writing. So, whether or not you go into an associate degree or a bachelor degree, and you go on, you might go on to do a master's or something of that nature. What you need to get good at doing is reading a whole lot of what other academic voices in your field of research have said. So, if you are researching different types of rocks, if you are researching wildlife, if you are researching the lifespan of wombats or something like that, you need to read a whole lot of what other people have read in a field and then locate what you think about that because you've read everything that everyone else has said. Now, what do you think? Where do you situate your voice? So, to identify the key ideas of other thinkers on a topic is important because you will eventually come to locate your own voice on this as well. And finally, to compare and synthesize the ideas of others in order to form an independent view. And that's where you will eventually come into it. Now, one thing I will emphasize with the descriptive essay is that you do not need to have an argument as such. It's a descriptive essay in the sense that if you are on a nursing pathway, then perhaps one day in the future you might have to write a descriptive essay on how to put an IV together. So that doesn't really necessarily require an argument, it just requires you to know the steps of how to put an IV together. So that's really where our thinking is at with this descriptive essay. So, note taking techniques, have a think about what your thoughts are on this. One point I made to my students in the Hobart lecture was that you're going to get a lot of advice from, well, not only from intro to academic writing lecturers and tutors, but you'll get advice from other units as well. And I think what's really important amongst all of this is for you to take that advice on board and think about what strategies work for you as an individual. So, do always feel free to take that time. If color coding is something that works for you, and I know that some students in my lecture really felt that color coding was a positive thing for them, then include that. If you are a visual learner and you need to do a lot of underlining and you need to work color into what you're doing, and maybe you need to actually mind map a few things because it makes things more visual and easier to understand, that might be something you need to work into your note taking as you deconstruct the text. So, in terms of note taking techniques, these are some options for you. So, number one, you could write or comment on the actual reading. I personally still do this when I read articles because I find that it's a good way of figuring out what I think. So, scribbles in the margins and highlighting are still my go tos when I read an article. You can actually use diagrams. So, as I just mentioned, if you're a visual learner, then a mind map might be a really good way to get into an article. And you might write questions that you have about the text as well as a means of understanding it. And number four, express the writer's ideas in your own words. If there are some really tricky areas of language, and there almost always are in particular articles that you might read, try and put them in your own words so that you can play around with that language and understand it a little bit more. Okay, so here's an activity for you to have a look at. So we're going to be doing this in the lecture. Distant students, um, I would encourage you to do this and maybe talk about it on your discussion boards. I think this would be a really useful thing for you to do. So look at your copy of the Dweck article. I would strongly encourage you to print off the Dweck article if you haven't done so already. I know that you can read it on devices and things like that, but trust me when I say that it is much easier to write notes and interrogate a text if you have a hard copy of it. So look at your copy. Have you used any of the note making techniques we've just discussed? If so, which ones? And see how your partner has taken notes. So you might like to compare on the discussion boards how other people have taken notes. I personally think that would be a really useful activity because, as I said previously, you're all individuals and you're given a lot of advice about note taking and completing assessments. But I think it's also really useful to collaborate and to talk about what might suit you. And maybe there's another idea from another student that might suit your style as well. So, number four, are you happy with your technique? What might you try next time? Those would be really great things to collaborate on discussion boards. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to pause the lecture. So you might want to get up and make yourself a drink or something like that. And I'll be back soon with part two.